Hi, I'm Zoe, and today I'd like to share my Fall 2020 thesis project with you. Moodscapes is my collection of 25 9 by 12-inch watercolor paintings that reflect a personal journey in exploring my unconscious mind and developing emotional regulation. Both yoga and art have been two important practices to me for a while now. They each help me to come into contact with the most authentic aspects of myself and have brought me through periods of anxiety and depression. When approaching my project, I began to consider the ways that both yoga and art can be healing for myself and others on a variety of levels. That led me to investigate how I could infuse both practices together in order to expand upon each of their benefits. Over the course of a month, I created daily paintings in combination with yogic practices as a means of personal inquiry and healing. I wove uninhibited painting in between meditation, mindful movement, and breathwork. This project was intended to be process-based rather than to achieve a particular visual outcome. For this reason, I'm going to abstain from going into visual analysis of my watercolor paintings due to the emphasis on creation rather than product. However, it's important that I share images of my work so the viewer can participate in the experience of what developed. Rather than going into visual analysis, I'll instead discuss the theories, history, and scientific evidence that my project builds upon. I'm going to dive into each of these aspects one step at a time, and then connect them back to my work more fully at the end of my discussion today. Yogic and artistic practices have been critical to my mental health among our turbulent global circumstances. My hope is that it may inspire others to use art, yoga, or any other personally meaningful resource as vehicles for connecting to their deepest self. Moodscapes largely builds upon psychological theories, art historical examples, and science-based evidence as inspiration. I'd like to move forward by discussing the psychological theories that support my work. Contemporary psychology has undoubtedly been influenced by Freudian concepts related to the unconscious mind that were initially laid out at the beginning of the 20th century. Many of Sigmund Freud's ideas have received a large amount of criticism due to their hyperfixation on sexual impulses as responsible for driving mental and behavioral functions. However, he continued to develop his ideas well into the middle of the 20th century, and the notion of the unconscious still serves as a foundational concept for many theories of mind that hold relevance today. Freud popularized the idea that our mind operates on multiple levels with many aspects under our own awareness. The metaphor of the iceberg is often used to describe the parts of the psyche we do not know, but still affect and influence us without our realization. These basic premises described by Freud have been expanded upon and studied in a multitude of ways, but his essential concept of the unconscious is important to recognize for further discussions that will develop within this presentation. Carl Jung's psychoanalytic theories are also important to my project. Jung built on Freud in many ways, but an important distinction is the way he expanded notions of the unconscious beyond fixations primarily related to sexual impulses. Jung's concept of the shadow refers to aspects of the self that are unfavorable and therefore ignored due to the uncomfortable emotions they often bring up. Jung argued that true self-knowledge requires coming to terms with shadow aspects of the self in order to come to a state of total integration and well-being. The work required for someone to uncover what rests within what Freud would deem the unconscious, and Jung the shadow, often leads to varying degrees of pain due to related emotions there. The popular phrase, facing your demons, is illustrative of this dynamic, but Jung emphasized self-knowledge as an important reason for coming to terms with unrealized aspects of the self. Paintings such as this one and Moodscapes are reflective of my effort to dive into my unconscious and shadow self. While art is used as a vehicle to facilitate inner expression, yoga is used as a tool to develop an emotional capacity to handle whatever may arise. Now that I've discussed the psychological theories behind my work, I'd like to move on to artists who serve as further inspiration for Moodscapes. Many artists of the early to mid-20th century began to take interest in Freudian and Jungian theories as they were being developed and popularized during that time period. The Surrealist movement of the early 20th century has been noted as the first group to infuse these psychological theories within their work, which served as inspiration for new artistic techniques and methods. One example of that is automatism, which eventually developed after André Breton wrote his Surrealist Manifesto in 1922. He defined surrealism as pure psychic automatism, the dictation of thought in the absence of all control exercised by reason and outside all moral or aesthetic concerns. This practice employed the use of writing, drawing, or painting in a free and uninhibited manner as a means of connecting to the unconscious. Surrealist artists such as Joan Miro and André Masson believed that letting marks and words flow out of the hand without focusing on a particular outcome allowed unknown aspects of the psyche to come forth. Thus, automatism served as a gateway to uncovering what would normally remain hidden from awareness within what Jung would refer to as the shadow. Other practices beyond automatism have also been utilized by artists who were interested in illuminating unknown aspects of their mind, and Joseph Beuys's work from the 1960s to his death in 1986 serves as another example of this endeavor. Beuys felt that art itself was the most suitable catalyst for transforming one's consciousness, and the performative nature of his work utilized ritual as an essential practice for this endeavor. One way that Beuys specifically practiced ritual in his work was through altering space, as seen in Eurasian Staff of 1967. He softened the sharp corners of a room with sections of fat before carrying out his performance in order to communicate a transformation of consciousness among what he viewed as an increasingly desensitized world. Beuys utilized heavily personal materials that connected to his near-death experience in a plane crash while he was in the German Air Force among World War II. His rescuers used fat in order to keep him warm within a tent while he remained in an extended period of unconsciousness. This led Beuys to integrate fat and other materials significant to that experience within his later artworks. The use of symbolic materials related to a life-changing unconscious experience along with performative spaces, became a ritualistic way for Beuys to practice inner investigations and personal healing. The desire to confront our unconscious mind is a common theme explored both by Surrealists and Joseph Beuys. While these examples certainly do not cover the entire scope of artists who have explored these themes in their work, they serve to illustrate some well-known figures throughout history who have integrated psychological theory within their artistic practices. Moodscapes takes a slightly different approach in exploring the unconscious, but it's still very much related to the psychological concepts found in Surrealism and Beuys's work. I'm primarily interested in the ways that exploring the shadow can lead to healing on an emotional level. It's crucial that we have a healthy and manageable way to explore our shadow selves, since it's inherently wrapped up in strong emotions that can be hard to process. Emotions often bring up incredibly difficult mental and physical experiences, which is why we tend to avoid them and the related pain of dealing with what might arise. Freud discussed this tendency in terms of defense mechanisms, and while it's certainly possible to be aware of our ability to quote-unquote push things down, this is usually a habit that's performed without us even realizing its occurrence, as this cartoon illustrates. We can teach ourselves skills that help us mindfully handle what might come up while investigating our inner selves. Moodscapes integrates the therapeutic benefits of both artistic and yogic practices in order to actively replace habitual defense mechanisms with more constructive ways of knowing and processing our unconscious. Now I'd like to discuss the therapeutic benefits of yoga that increase one's ability to mindfully attend to the shadow self and regulate emotions. While the term shadow isn't necessarily always used in an explicit manner, there are strong parallels to Jungian psychology in the way that many researchers reference the emotional ties related to the unconscious. One study in particular defines emotional self-regulation as the management of the felt experience of emotions, both positive and negative in valence, its behavioral expression, and associated autonomic output. Many researchers discuss two possible routes for achieving this goal that are described as top-down and bottom-up mechanisms. As seen in this figure, top-down mechanisms on the left include meditation and ethical observances, which are engaged through higher-level brain networks. Bottom-up mechanisms seen on the right include sustained physical postures and breath control, which are engaged through low-level brain networks. It's through a combination of these mechanisms that emotional well-being is achieved through yoga. Together, they contribute to a growing ability for an individual to manage their emotional experience that's developed through continual practice. Researchers are also beginning to study the link between emotions in the body by empirically observing the way that posture and movements relate to inner affective states. One particular study evaluated the difference between people who sat in a slumped or depressive posture versus an upright or non-depressive posture. Those who sat upright were more likely to have non-depressed thoughts than those who sat hunched over. While the focus here was purely on what can be understood as bottom-up or lower-level brain mechanisms, it's reflective of the significance that engagement of the body can have on our emotional states. This is one primary reason that yoga is such an effective tool. However, it's important to remember that yoga also consists of top-down or higher-level brain mechanisms in which we recognize what we're feeling and bring mindfulness to that, rather than letting our unconscious drive behaviors and thoughts. Another study that demonstrates both the top-down and bottom-up effects of yoga focused on high school students who ranged from 15 to 17 years old in a public school setting. One group of students was randomly assigned to stay in their general physical education class, while another randomized group was placed in a yoga intervention class that lasted for 16 weeks. The results clearly showed a difference in the ability for students in the yoga intervention class to regulate their own emotions as compared to those in a regular PE class. This study demonstrated a more comprehensive outcome of yoga than just posture alone by also utilizing breathwork, relaxation, and intention setting in order to measure emotional regulation between both groups. It's clear then that the benefits of yoga do not solely arise from just moving and breathing alone, but also through the integration of mindfulness practices, which are typically absent from purely physical-based exercises. Now that I've established the therapeutic benefits of yoga, I would like to discuss those related to art. Art therapy has been gaining increasing traction for its ability to contribute toward emotional regulation and overall well-being for individuals. Within a clinical context, art therapy has continuously been shown to help people cope with difficult emotional states in a positive way through the use of various mediums and visual outputs. The limbic system of the brain includes functions responsible for the emotional activity that stirs within us, and it is especially sensitive to affect-laden imagery. The emotional sensitivity of this area in our brains gives a basic explanation as to why art making can be such an emotionally rich experience. Art therapists focus on using art making in very specific ways that require awareness and reflection of the imagery in order to achieve the benefits and intended outcome of emotional regulation. There's an emphasis on safety for the individual who's making the artwork, in addition to attentiveness to the ways that creating art can actually alter how we think and feel. The use of art therapy for individuals who have experienced trauma in some manner has been essential to research related to the importance of mindfulness in developing emotional regulation through art making. People who suffer from trauma often dissociate their difficult experiences both in their bodies and minds in order to cope with the painful emotions that they've endured. While this is certainly an understandable way for trauma survivors to handle their experiences, it can eventually detract from their well-being in the long run if their unmet wounds are not tended to. A common problem that people with trauma often face is known as alexithymia, and this term refers to difficulty in identifying and labeling emotional states. Alexithymia includes varying degrees of unconsciousness regarding the traumatic experience that is relative to each individual and is accompanied by nonverbal ways of knowing. This nonverbal way of knowing is largely why art therapy can provide successful ways of addressing one's emotional experiences, since visual expression provides a way of communication that words inherently cannot. The goal of art therapy for trauma survivors is to eventually help people bring association back to their bodies and form a safe, cognitive understanding of the experiences that they went through in order to heal. Nonverbal ways of knowing are not solely specific to those who have experienced trauma, however, and anyone who has had a dream they can only understand through visual imagery rather than words can attest to this. This is certainly an experience that I'm personally very familiar with, which is why I'm choosing to integrate art making into my process of exploring my own unconscious world. With Moodscapes, I've been pairing visual expression with mindfulness techniques that are based on yogic practices in order to create a dynamic approach to uncovering my own shadow in a constructive and healing way. This has been a profound experience for me that has taken a lot of time to refine, and it continues to be an evolving practice. The current global context that we find ourselves in among 2020 is troublesome in many ways regarding everything from political uncertainty to growing environmental concerns, and especially the COVID-19 pandemic. In combination with these issues, many people are experiencing social isolation, which is all contributing toward a crisis in mental health. While the extent that these issues affect people on a personal level certainly varies, social media, the news, and firsthand experiences have made it clear to me that the need for emotional regulation and healthy coping mechanisms are critical right now. While art therapy offers one place for people to come into contact with these skills, not everyone has access to this type of resource that can often be costly or limited to certain geographic areas. I personally had little to no exposure on how to handle difficult emotions until I became an adult and happened to stumble upon yoga and art. These have together been my primary outlet for processing the difficulties of life. I have been integrating my own research related to the field into personal practices that have made a huge impact in helping me regulate my mental health. Moodscapes is a reflection of a long and continuous process of personal introspection related to my unconscious mind. In many ways, the artistic process draws upon automatism as used by the surrealists, but I use watercolor as my primary choice in materials. I found that the fluidity of watercolor allowed me to paint without afterthought as much as possible, as opposed to writing or drawing alone. I'm also able to explore a wide and almost unlimited range of color by both mixing paint quickly and allowing colors to flow into each other on the page. My work also contains elements of ritual as seen in the work of Joseph Beuys, as I have a somewhat consistent process in how I go about making the paintings. I begin by laying out my yoga mat and art materials, and then sit in stillness and turn my attention inward. This allows me to come into contact with my felt experience and set an intention for my practice. As with Beuys, my rituals are very process-based and related to specific materials in order to create a space where a transformation of consciousness can occur. This also connects back to the idea of alexithymia and unconscious ways of knowing that are nonverbal, as I discussed in relationship to art therapy. I use my watercolors as an expression of things within me that I've been unable to communicate with words prior to seeing them on paper. I strive to bring awareness to whatever arises by sitting with it in meditation and also journaling about what comes up after I'm done. This form of free writing is also similar to the automatic writing that accompanied Breton's surrealist practices. I've learned many things about myself as I've gone through this project that have been both very meaningful and at times surprising to me. This process has given me a lot of clarity with many things in my daily life that I've been struggling with, and has helped me begin healing certain key relationships in my life. It's also served as a coping mechanism through difficult global circumstances and provided me with a deeper sense of self-knowing that I personally find very important to live an authentic and meaningful life. My hope for anyone witnessing Moodscapes is that they might consider their relationship with their own inner self at its deepest level, and perhaps utilize art making and yoga as vehicles for connection. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and also thank you so much to all the professors, family, friends, everyone else who helped me in making this happen and provided support and guidance along the way.